the second week of January, 1887, while every other rider along the western slope of the Rockies had already pulled their horses off the winter routes and settled into warm stables until spring, Patrick Callahan was doing something else entirely. He was saddling up. For the 11th winter in a row, he tightened the girth strap on his sorrel mare in the pale gray light before dawn, buckled a battered canvas satchel across his shoulder, and pointed her nose toward Ironwood Pass. Snow had already fallen twice that week. The trail above the tree line had disappeared beneath drift, and the wind coming off the divide had teeth in it that could open a man's cheek in under a mile. Every other rider on the front range knew what winter did to fools who tried to cross before the March thaw. Patrick simply nodded to the postmaster, took the satchel without opening it, and rode out. He never asked what was inside. He never once in 11 winters lifted the flap to look. Postmasters in 3 towns had tested him with sealed envelopes marked for inspection, and he had handed each back untouched at the far end of the route. Some called it superstition. Others called it a quiet dignity belonging to a vanished century. Patrick himself only ever gave the same short answer when asked. "A man who reads the mail," he would say, "is not a mail rider. He is a nuisance with a horse." By that January morning, Patrick had become something close to a legend in the high country of Colorado Territory. 11 winters across Ironwood Pass without a missed delivery. Not once. Not in the blizzard of '82 that killed 3 miners in a cabin barely half a mile off the trail. Not in the ice storm of '85 that pulled the telegraph lines all the way down to Denver. Not in the March whiteout of '86 that swallowed a mule team whole and left behind only a cracked bell in the snow. Patrick had ridden through all of it, late once by 6 hours, never absent. Down in Redwater Valley on the far side of the pass, families set their pocket watches by his Thursday arrival. Children ran to the mercantile porch when they heard the sorrel's hooves clopping onto the frozen boards. Old widows kept coffee warm on the stove every Thursday afternoon, because Thursday meant Patrick, and Patrick meant news from the world beyond the mountains. But that January, something else was moving through Redwater Valley, something that did not care about weather or riders or perfect records. It had begun in the schoolhouse 2 weeks earlier. A child came home with a fever and a strange gray film across the back of her throat. Within 4 days, 3 more children in the same one-room class had it. By week's end, the doctor from Silver Fork had ridden down at full gallop with a leather bag and a face gone the color of tallow. He had seen this before in an army camp during the war. He knew the name of it before he stepped down from his saddle: diphtheria. By the second Thursday of January, when Patrick tied his sorrel to the rail outside the Silver Fork post office to collect the weekly satchel, the doctor was already waiting for him on the boardwalk. And in the doctor's hands was not a bundle of letters, but a small padded wooden case wrapped in oilcloth, packed tight against the cold. What was inside that little wooden case would break an 11-year superstition in a single breath. It would ask Patrick Callahan to do something no male rider on the western slope had ever survived. Would he cross Ironwood Pass one final time? Or would the mountain finally claim the rider it had spent 11 winters trying to keep? Subscribe now to witness the ride that ended a legend. The doctor's name was Nathaniel Hoyt, and he had ridden through the night from Silver Fork to be at the Redwater post office by the time Patrick's Thursday route brought him through. He was a lean, tired-looking man in his late 50s, with the kind of eyes that had watched too many small pine coffins get carried down from the mining camps. When Patrick swung down from the sorrel, Hoyt did not offer a greeting. He simply held out the wooden case with both hands, the way a man might hand across a newborn. "Callahan," he said, "there's 12 vials in here, 12 doses of antitoxin. If they freeze, they're worthless. If they get down to the valley by Sunday morning, I can save most of the children. If they don't, we'll be digging graves through frozen ground for a week." Patrick looked at the case, then at the doctor's face. He did not take it. "Not yet. How many are sick?" he asked. 19 when I left this morning. It'll be 25 by nightfall, maybe 30 by tomorrow." Hoyt's jaw worked once. "The Millers lost their youngest 2 days ago. Widow Renfrew's boy went last night. It moves through a schoolhouse the way fire moves through dry grass." Patrick was silent for a long moment. The wind coming down from the pass rattled the hitching rail beside them, and his mare shifted her weight from one hoof to the other. Snow was already spitting sideways along the length of the boardwalk. The sky over the western peaks had gone the color of a bruise. "Why me?" Patrick said finally. Hoyt did not answer straight away. He looked at Patrick with something strange in his expression, something almost like an apology he could not yet speak. Then he said, "Because you're the only man in 3 counties who's ever crossed Ironwood in January. Because the train stopped at Denver and won't move again for 4 days. Because the telegraph's down past the summit and there's no other way to reach that valley alive." He paused. "And because I know you'll get it there, Callahan, I know it." There was more in the doctor's voice than there should have been. Patrick heard it, but he did not press. 11 years of carrying other people's business without asking had made him a man who let silences stand. He took the case. For the first time since the winter of 1876, Patrick Callahan opened the flap of his mail satchel with another man watching. He unbuckled the leather strap slowly, folded back the canvas, and looked inside. Bundles of letters tied with string. A newspaper folded twice. A small parcel wrapped in brown paper. And now, cradled in the middle, the wooden case with its oilcloth wrapping and its 12 fragile lives inside. He closed the satchel again, rebuckled the strap, slung it back across his shoulder. "Sunday morning," he said. "Sunday morning," Hoyt echoed. Patrick was already turning toward the mare when a rough voice called out from the far end of the boardwalk. "You'll be dead by Saturday, Callahan." The speaker was Angus Reeve, a former stage driver who had lost a team and half a foot to the pass 15 years earlier and had not gone above the tree line since. He stood in the doorway of the feed store with his arms folded and his mouth set in the flat, hard line of a man who had earned his fear the hard way. Snow blew in behind him through the open door, and no one moved to close it. Patrick did not answer him. He mounted the sorrel, touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat, and rode out into the rising storm. The first 3 miles out of Silver Fork were the easy ones. The wagon road wound south along Bishop's Creek, sheltered on both sides by tall stands of ponderosa pine that leaned over the trail and broke the wind into scattered gusts. Snow fell steadily but not yet dangerously, and the sorrel, a strong-shouldered mare Patrick called Junebug, moved at a steady walk that ate the miles without wasting her. Patrick rode with the mail satchel high on his chest, not slung at his side. He had adjusted the strap before leaving town, so the wooden case sat almost against his sternum, where his coat and his own body heat would keep it above freezing longer than any saddlebag ever could. The bundle of ordinary letters he had pulled out and buttoned into the deep inside pocket of his Mackinaw. If the world had to lose one or the other today, it would lose the letters. He had prepared himself with the quiet care of a man who had done this 100 times. 2 pairs of wool socks beneath greased leather boots, a rabbit fur vest under the Mackinaw, a knit cap under the wide-brim hat, tied down with rawhide beneath his chin. In the saddle's scabbard, not a rifle was weight, and weight killed men on the pass, but a short-handled axe for cutting through drift, and if it came to it, for putting Junebug down quickly if she broke a leg. He knew this trail the way other men knew their own kitchens. He had ridden it 283 times. The counting was a habit. Some things a man did not want to think about too directly on a January morning, so he thought around them instead in numbers. 283 crossings, 11 winters, 67 miles from post office to post office, 14 switchbacks above the tree line. 29 landmarks he had memorized so well he could name them with his eyes closed. A split cedar at mile 41. A red boulder shaped like a bishop's mitre at mile 48. A broken wagon axle no one had ever come back for at mile 52. He had not always been a male rider. He had come west in the spring of 1874 with a young woman named Cora, both of them barely 22, both of them foolish in the particular way that made people load their whole lives into a single wagon and drive it toward a horizon they had only seen in newspaper drawings. She had been a schoolteacher's daughter from a town in western Pennsylvania. He had been a stonemason's apprentice with more temper than sense. What they had between them for those first 2 years in Colorado had been the best thing either of them had ever known. Patrick did not think about how it ended. He never did, not on the trail. There were things a man could not carry across Ironwood Pass and hope to come back down alive, and the shape of that ending was one of them. He knew only that by the summer of 1876, he had ridden away from a small cabin south of Redwater Valley with nothing but his horse, his coat, and a silence he had not broken since. By the fall of that year, he was carrying mail across the pass. Junebug's ears flicked forward. Patrick looked up. Ahead, the pine cover thinned. The trail bent left and began to climb, and beyond the last screen of trees, the great gray wall of Ironwood Pass rose into the sky. The storm was already waiting for him at the tree line. The wind hit him the moment Junebug stepped past the last pine. It came down off the divide in a single sustained roar, not gusting, not poolsing, but pouring, the way water pours from a spillway when the gate is opened all the way. Snow moved across the open slope in horizontal sheets. Visibility, which had been a quarter-mile in the trees, dropped in 20 steps to less than the length of the mare's own body. Patrick pulled his scarf up over his mouth and nose, tugged his hat lower, and let Junebug find the trail beneath the snow with her hooves. He had been in worse. He told himself that carefully, as if placing a coin on a table. He had been in worse. The March whiteout of '86 had been worse. The blizzard of '82 had been worse. He knew what he was in and he knew the shape of it, and a man who knew the shape of a storm could get through most of what the mountains threw at him. But somewhere in the first hour above the tree line, the shape began to change. It started with the sound. The wind had come in as a steady roar, and Patrick had settled his mind against that steadiness the way a man settles against the pull of a rope. Then, without warning, the roar broke apart into deep, shuddering pulses that arrived from different directions. First from the north, off the divide as expected. Then from the northwest. Then from directly ahead, straight down the throat of the pass, which was not a wind that Ironwood produced in January. Patrick pulled Junebug to a stop. He had learned to read the mountains whether the way old sailors read the sea. A shifting wind at the tree line was one thing. A wind that had lost its main direction entirely was something else. It meant a system larger than the pass itself was collapsing overhead, and when that happened above 11,000 feet, the snow no longer fell, it was thrown, from every angle at once, until the air itself became a solid moving wall. He had seen it happen exactly twice in 11 years. Both times, he had turned back. He reached inside his coat and put his gloved hand flat against the wooden case beneath his mackinaw. The oilcloth was cold through the leather of the glove, but the case itself, sheltered by his body, was still warm. 12 vials. 19 children when the doctor had left that morning, 25 by nightfall, 30 by tomorrow. He thought about Widow Renfrew's boy, whose name he did not know but whose small figure he had seen a dozen times on the mercantile porch waving as he rode past. Gone last night. He thought about the Miller family, whose youngest he had never met and now never would. He thought, without wanting to, about a girl he had never met either. A girl whose letters he had carried into Redwater Valley twice a year, every year, since she was old enough to hold a pen. He did not know her face. He did not know her voice. He had carried her mother's letters back the other way, into a hand that was not his and had never been his again. He had done this for 11 years without ever once opening a single envelope, and he did not know why the thought of that girl arrived to him now, out here on the open slope of the pass, with the wind falling apart around him. He did not turn back. He clicked his tongue, and Junebug walked forward into the white. By the 5th mile above the tree line, Patrick could no longer see Junebug's ears. The snow had thickened into the kind of whiteout that erased distance and shape together. Ground and sky were the same color. The trail beneath the mare's hooves had vanished under 2 feet of drift, and every step forward became a small act of faith that the ground would still be there when her weight came down. Twice, Junebug plunged chest-deep into hidden drift washes and had to lunge her way back onto firmer footing. The second time, she came out shaking. Patrick swung down from the saddle. It was the hardest decision a mountain rider ever made, to give up the height of the horse, to give up the small, extra warmth of her body beneath him, to walk on his own two legs into a storm that would tire him twice as fast. But a fallen horse in a whiteout was a death sentence for both of them, and Junebug had already stumbled once too many times. He looped the reins over his left forearm, tied the loose end to his belt with a slipknot, and set his boots into the snow. He walked. The wind pushed him sideways with every third step. His scarf had frozen against his mouth, and each breath drew a thin layer of ice across his teeth. He could feel his eyelashes crusting shut and had to keep brushing at them with a stiff mitten to keep his eyes clear enough to see the 10 feet of white in front of him. 10 feet. Sometimes less. Sometimes only the shape of Junebug's head at his shoulder, and beyond that, nothing at all. This was where the memorizing became everything. He had a system. He had built it slowly, over years, without ever telling anyone. Every landmark on the trail above the tree line had a number, and every number had a step count between it and the next. From the last pine at the tree line to the split cedar was 312 steps at a normal walking pace. From the split cedar to the red boulder shaped like a miter was 407. From the miter boulder to the broken axle at mile 52 was 601 steps, angling northeast, with a small dip in the ground at step 318 that a man could feel through the soles of his boots even under 3 feet of snow. He had never told anyone. He had never even written it down. It lived in his head the way Psalms lived in the head of a preacher, worn smooth by repetition, until it was no longer memory but instinct. He counted his steps. He counted them out loud, because his own voice inside the scarf was the only sound in the world besides the wind, and the sound of a man's own voice was the last thing to leave him in a storm like this. He had watched 2 men die of exposure years ago in an army camp, and the second one had gone quiet a full hour before he stopped breathing. Patrick had promised himself he would never go quiet. 300, he said into the wool. 301. 302. Junebug walked beside him, her big head lowered against the wind, her breath making twin plumes of steam that vanished the instant they left her nostrils. She trusted him. That was the terrible thing about a good horse in a bad storm. She trusted him completely, and if he was wrong about the step count, they would both walk off the edge of the pass together. He was not wrong. At step 312, his mitten touched the split cedar. At the split cedar, he stopped just long enough to press his mittened hand against the trunk and let the certainty of it settle through him. The tree was real. The trail was where he remembered it. That single point of contact with something known was worth more in that moment than any warm room in Silver Fork. Then he began to sing. The songs were his own. No one in either post office town had ever heard him sing. Patrick Callahan was not a singing man in the ordinary run of a day, but for 11 winters on the pass, he had built songs the way other men built prayers. There was one for the stretch between the miter boulder and the broken axle, one for the long climb from mile 52 up to the summit, one for the descent past Elk Bone Hollow. Each of them set to old Irish tunes his mother had sung to him in a kitchen in Pennsylvania 40 years ago, but the words were his own, and the words were the trail itself. 601 to the axle and the drift, he sang into the scarf, and the wind at your back going home. His voice cracked. His throat was raw with cold air, but the song was a metronome that kept his feet moving, and the words were a rope that tied his mind to the map. He walked. Somewhere between the miter boulder and the broken axle, the fingers of his right hand went from painful to distant. Patrick knew what that meant. Every rider on the western slope knew what that meant. He shifted the reins to his left hand, tucked the right one under his coat against his own ribs, and kept counting. 480. 481. He tried to flex the fingers inside the mitten. 2 of them, the index and the middle, did not answer. They were still there. He could feel the leather of the mitten around them, but they had stopped belonging to him, the way a fence post at the edge of a field stopped belonging to the man who had driven it. He did not stop. Around what he judged to be the 6th hour above the tree line, the light began to fail. Not dramatically, there had been no proper light all day, only a pale gray shifting into a paler gray, but a deeper darkness began to seep into the whiteout the way ink seeps into wet paper. Night was coming. On Ironwood Pass in January, in a storm like this, night arrived early and stayed for 16 hours. He would not make the summit before dark. That, more than the cold, more than the frozen fingers, more than the wind, was the thought that finally reached down into the deep, quiet part of Patrick Callahan and rang like a struck bell. He kept walking. He kept singing. At step 601 from the Mitre boulder, his mitten struck something hard and angled beneath 3 feet of snow. He knelt down, brushed the drift away with his good hand, and felt the shape of a wagon axle broken clean at the socket. The axle no one had ever come back for. Mile 52. He was on the trail. He was still on the trail. Junebug lowered her head and pressed her long, warm face against his shoulder. Patrick let himself lean into her for one full breath. Then he stood up, coiled the reins again, and turned his boots toward the summit. The climb from the broken axle to the summit was 3 miles of switchbacks cut into a slope so steep that in summer a mule with a full pack had to be led by hand. In January, in a whiteout, with the light failing and the temperature falling past anything a thermometer in Silver Fork would have measured that morning, it became something else entirely. It became a ladder made of snow, and Patrick and Junebug climbed it one step at a time. He stopped counting steps somewhere on the second switchback. The numbers had gone slippery in his mind, and when a man's numbers went slippery, it meant the cold was reaching places it had no business reaching. He switched to the song for the summit climb instead, a slow one in 3/4 time, and let the rhythm of it move his boots for him. Halfway up, he opened his coat. It was the most dangerous thing he had done all day, and he did it deliberately. The wooden case against his sternum had shifted during a stumble, and he had to be certain the oilcloth was still tight around it and the vials were still warm. He worked the buttons with his left hand. The right one was no longer capable of buttons, and slid 2 fingers inside against his own skin. The case was warm, warmer than his own chest almost, because his chest was beginning to lose its own heat. He rebuckled the coat as fast as his hand would allow. The cold that had gotten inside during those 30 seconds took nearly a mile to work back out. He thought briefly about the doctor's face on the boardwalk. "Because I know you'll get it there, Callahan. I know it." There had been something wrong in that sentence. Patrick had heard it at the time, in the way a man hears a floorboard creak in a house he thought was empty. He had let it pass because he had let a great many things pass over 11 years, and passing things was what a good male rider did. But out here, on the second switchback of the summit climb, with his right hand gone, and his voice cracking through the last verse of a song no one else had ever heard, the memory of that sentence came back to him and would not leave. He knew why. He had known why for a long time if he was honest with himself, which he had spent most of 11 years trying not to be. Dr. Hoyt had been the man who delivered a child in a cabin south of Redwater Valley in the winter of 1876. Patrick had been 300 miles east that week, walking away from the woman he had promised to stay with and toward a life that would not require him to look any of it in the face. He had heard about the birth secondhand, months later, from a rider in Cheyenne. A girl, healthy. Cora had named her. He had never asked the name. For 11 years he had carried her letters and never once looked at the return address. The wind screamed once, hard out of the north, and Junebug staggered sideways into him and nearly knocked him from the trail. Patrick caught himself with his left hand on her withers and stood shaking for a moment against her flank, feeling the great deep heat of the mare through his coat and understanding, with a clarity the cold had somehow sharpened rather than dulled, that he had been the doctor's second choice for a reason. He had been the only man in 3 counties with a reason to get there alive. He crested the summit sometime after full dark. He knew it was the summit not by anything he could see. He could see nothing, only the small pale halo of Junebug's head beside him, but by the sudden change in the ground beneath his boots. The climb went out of it. For the length of a breath, the earth was level. Then it began to fall away in the other direction, and Patrick Callahan stood at 11,400 feet on Ironwood Pass at 7 o'clock at night in January, and he was still alive. He did not stop. Stopping at the summit was another way men died on this mountain. He had heard the stories a dozen times as a young rider of men who had made the climb, felt the ground level out beneath them, and sat down for 1 minute in the snow to rest. 1 minute became 5. 5 became the last minute of their lives. Patrick clicked his tongue to Junebug and started down. The descent was in some ways worse than the climb. Going up, a man's own weight pulled against him and kept him honest. Going down, the mountain wanted to take him faster than his legs could carry him, and every step became a small negotiation between gravity and the ice under his boots. Twice on the first switchback below the summit, he went down on one knee and had to use the axe from Junebug's saddle scabbard as a crutch to lever himself back up. The right hand was gone past the wrist now. He no longer tried to move it. He sang. The song for the descent past Elk Bone Hollow was the longest of them all, 17 verses, and he made it through 11 before his voice went out entirely. After that he mouthed the words inside the scarf and let the shape of them move his boots. He did not remember the last mile. He remembered the pines coming back around him at the lower tree line, sudden and dark and blessed shelter after so many hours in the open. He remembered Junebug walking faster on her own, without any signal from him, because a horse knows the way to a warm barn the way a compass knows north. He remembered the trail flattening. He remembered, dimly, the sound of a dog barking somewhere ahead. He remembered a light. The light was a lantern held up on the porch of the Redwater Valley Mercantile at 3 o'clock on a Sunday morning, by a boy of about 14 who had been posted there by the doctor's orders, and who had been waiting since Friday afternoon for a rider no reasonable man expected to arrive. The boy saw Junebug first. The mare walked out of the falling snow and into the pool of lantern light with her rider still upright in his own boots beside her, one hand on her withers, his face the color of old candle wax. The boy dropped the lantern. Patrick did not see the lantern fall. He saw the boy's mouth open and heard, from a long way off, the boy shout for someone. Then the boy was running down the Mercantile steps toward him, and other doors were opening along the street, and the doctor from Silver Fork, who had ridden ahead 2 days earlier and had been sitting up every night since, was coming out of the boarding house across the way in shirt sleeves with his suspenders hanging down. Patrick unbuttoned his coat with his left hand. He drew the wooden case out from against his own chest and held it toward the running boy. Then his knees gave. He came back to the world in a bed he did not recognize, in a room that smelled of pine smoke and something sharper beneath it, the medicinal tang of carbolic acid. Gray morning light came through a curtained window. A stove crackled somewhere out of sight. His right hand was bandaged from the wrist down, wrapped tight in clean white linen that ended at the second knuckle of what had once been 5 fingers. Dr. Hoyt was sitting in a straight-backed chair beside the bed. He looked older than he had on the boardwalk in Silver Fork. His shirt was rumpled. His eyes were red-rimmed from sleep he had not taken. He was holding a tin cup of coffee in both hands as if it were the only warm thing in the world. "The vials," Patrick said. His voice came out as barely a whisper. "All 12, the doctor said. Every one of them still warm when you handed them over. I've dosed 19 children since Sunday morning. 15 will live. 2 more we're not sure about yet. 2 we lost before you got here." Patrick closed his eyes. The doctor set the tin cup down on the small table beside the bed and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "I have to tell you something, Callahan." "I know," Patrick said. There was a long silence in the room. Outside, somewhere down the street, a hammer struck twice on wood and then went still. A dog barked once. A woman called a child in from the cold. The first name on the list was Emily, the doctor said. Emily Callahan. She turned 11 in October. She was the 3rd child in the schoolhouse to take sick, and she was the worst of them by Saturday morning. That's why I rode down. That's why I sent for you. There was no other rider who was going to make that pass in that storm for a list of names he did not know, and I could not put a child's name in a telegram to a man in Silver Fork and ask him to guess. I had to be the one to hand it to you. I had to be the one to look you in the face. Patrick did not open his eyes. "Cora is here," Hoyt said quietly. "She's in the kitchen. She has been here since Friday night. She knows you came. She knows what you carried. She is not asking for anything from you, Callahan. She has never asked for anything from you. But Emily is in the next room. And Emily is alive because of the case you kept warm against your chest for 67 miles. And I thought a man ought to be told, before he decides what he does with the rest of his life, that this is the shape of what he did yesterday. Patrick opened his eyes. The doctor was looking at him with the same expression he had worn on the boardwalk in Silver Fork, the apology he had not yet been able to speak, now finally spoken. "Does she know?" Patrick asked. "The girl. She knows a rider brought the medicine. She does not know who the rider was. Then don't tell her yet." "I won't." Patrick lay still for a long time. He could hear very faintly the sound of a woman's voice in a room somewhere at the back of the house, low and steady, reading aloud from what sounded like a book of Psalms. The voice paused. A child's voice, small and hoarse, asked a question. The woman's voice answered. Patrick turned his face toward the wall, and for the first time in 11 years he wept. He did not ride the pass again. The news of it traveled up and down the western slope, faster than any rider could have carried it. By the end of that week, everyone in Silver Fork and Redwater Valley, and half the mining camps between them, knew that Patrick Callahan had crossed Ironwood in the worst January storm in 20 years, on foot for the last 30 miles, singing to himself in the dark, and had put 12 glass vials of antitoxin into a doctor's hands at 3 o'clock on a Sunday morning, still warm from his own body. They knew he had lost 2 fingers to the frost. They knew the perfect record, 284 crossings, 11 winters, never absent, had ended on the day it stopped being a record and became something else. What most of them did not know, for a long time, was the rest of it. He stayed in the small back bedroom of the boarding house through the end of January and most of February. Cora brought him meals on a tray. She did not speak to him at first about anything that mattered, and he did not ask her to. They had 11 years of silence between them, and silence like that did not come apart in a single conversation. It came apart the way a hard drift comes apart in spring, slowly, from underneath, one warm afternoon at a time. Emily recovered by the second week of February. She came into the back bedroom on a Sunday morning wrapped in a wool shawl, with her mother behind her in the doorway, and she looked at the thin, gray-faced man in the bed with the careful curiosity of a child who has been told a story and is trying to fit the face in front of her to the shape of it. Patrick did not know what to say to her. He had spent 11 years carrying her letters and had never once imagined the moment of meeting her, because to imagine it would have been to admit that he wanted it, and he had not been a man who allowed himself to want that for a very long time. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She looked at his bandaged hand. "Mama says you brought the medicine," she said. "I did." "Mama says you rode through the pass in the storm." "I did." She was quiet for a moment, considering him with the grave attention that only children of a certain age can produce. "Are you going to stay?" she asked. Patrick looked past her, at Cora standing in the doorway, and Cora looked back at him with an expression he had not seen on her face in 11 years and had never in that time deserved to see again. She did not nod. She did not speak. She only waited, the way she had once waited for him on a porch in Pennsylvania in the spring of 1874, when they had both been 22 and the whole country west of the Mississippi had felt like a promise they could keep. "Yes," Patrick said. "I'm going to stay." Down at the Silver Fork post office, a new rider was hired in March. A young man out of Cheyenne with a good horse and no sense yet of what the mountain could do to him. He crossed Ironwood every Thursday from then on, and every Thursday until the day he died, Patrick Callahan sat on the porch of a small cabin south of Redwater Valley and watched the western sky above the pass and waited for a rider who was no longer him. He never opened the mail again, but he stayed.